Et donc, depuis l'Égypte, nous allons maintenant basculer, comme je viens de le dire, beaucoup plus à l'est, dans le plateau iranien, en accueillant, on en est très heureux, Jacob Dahl, qui est professeur d'assyriologie à l'Université de Oxford, après être passé notamment par Copenhague, Los Angeles, Berlin, et puis Paris où il a pu notamment travailler au département d'Antiquité orientale sur les textes proto-élamites, dont il va maintenant vous parler beaucoup mieux, avec cette conférence qui va de Uruk, en Asie du Sud, à Suse, sur le plateau occidental iranien, l'ouest du plateau iranien, donc sur le fait de déchiffrer le proto-élamite. Merci beaucoup.
Unfortunately, I will be speaking in English. I apologize very much for that. I think there is translation available if needed. So I want to start with a couple of general words on where we are with decipherment of or study of ancient writing systems. So over the past 2 decades, most collection owners have understood the need to release all of their data into the public space, and simultaneously it has also become cheaper and easier to produce new and better images of ancient texts. But I don't think that we just have more access and better technology. We also have new methods. Where previous generations relied on static indexes, for example, we can mine our digital corpora. And we are at the cusp, I think, of a potential new revolution in the study of ancient texts and ancient art, where we are soon able to tag images and use machine learning to pre-segment visual data. And we will soon, I hope, be able to data mine our images, opening up new avenues of research. In this talk, I'll first outline what was known about archaic texts, that is, late 4th and early 3rd millennium texts from Mesopotamia, before the discovery of the Proto-Elamite tablets, to assess what the excavators of Susa could be expected to know about early Western Asian scripts, before looking at the early work on Mesopotamian archaic texts, principally from Uruk. I'll then outline the step change that happened when the decipherment of Proto-Cuneiform and Proto-Elamite went from being the domain of traditional Assyriologists, who had by then come up short, to being the domain of historians of mathematics working with specialists of early writing and Assyriologists. And I will then point to some recent and ongoing work before touching on the topic that I know everyone wants to hear about, namely the potential linguistic decipherment of Proto-Elamite. But I think, of course, that no talk about Proto-Elamite can commence without a few words about what Proto-Elamite is. So what is it? Well, first it's important to note that the name Proto-Elamite is simply just a construction by Vincent Shale, who believed the Elamites to have had their own writing system Elamite while speaking Ancient. This, of course, have turned out to be incorrect. The Elamites wrote mostly in cuneiform, and today we call their language Elamite. Ethnic groups don't invent writing systems that fit their language. That is an anachronism. Sure enough, there are examples of this in the past few hundred years, when writing systems have been invented for example, Cherokee and similar, but that's not how it worked in the past. Proto-Elamite was largely loaned from Proto-Cuneiform and then developed very independently to a certain extent before disappearing rapidly. Proto-Elamite does not, basically, convey much linguistic information or spoken language. It is not a communicative system. This is not only clear from the structure of the text, but also from the fact that the signery, the sign list, was never standardized. Judging from the complexity of the Susa texts, the scale of the economy recorded in the Susa texts, and the proven dependency of Proto-Elamite on Mesopotamian Proto-Cuneiform, and Susa's proximity to southern Mesopotamia, Proto-Elamite was probably invented at Susa. The Proto-Elamite corpus is large compared to other undeciphered and early corpora, with more than 1,700 texts and fragments that were found at Susa alone. And the corpus to date consists of more than 10,000 lines of text. But let us start in the early days of cuneiform studies, when the script of the Neo-Assyrian library of Ashurbanipal had been deciphered, and consider how scholars dealt with the very first archaic texts available to scholarship. The Nippur excavations of Hermann Hilprecht from the late 1880s and Ernst de Sasse's excavations at Girsu from the late 1870s produced corpora of text in Sumerian, a language already then known from the scholarly texts in Ashurbanipal's library. But the very first two archaic texts to be known were the so-called Blau Monuments, which, despite frequently being claimed to be forgeries, are today regarded as authentic and belonging to an exclusive group of archaic Mesopotamian texts on stone. The Blau Monuments were first published by William Hayes Ward in 1885, after he had seen them in the house of Dr. Blau, a doctor, merchant, and collector living in southern Iraq in the last decades of the 19th century. Ward was able to photograph the objects and discuss their relationship to the then known cuneiform texts, claiming that the figures are similar to those of certain tello objects. It's not quite clear which ones he meant. But that the script was earlier, and I quote, "It has not yet passed out of the stage of hieroglyphs." When the Walters tablet and the Hoffman tablet were first published, the knowledge of early cuneiform had greatly increased, particularly with the publication of Tour d'Ancham's masterful Recherche sur l'origine de l'écriture cunéiforme in 1898, and Barton was able to translate some of the text of these two tablets, as well as the Blau monument. I think I was a bit behind there. At the end of the early campaigns at Girsu, Tour d'Ancham published his sign list, as I just mentioned, which is still very useful, the Recherche sur l'origine de l'écriture cunéiforme, which was the first list of early cuneiform signs. Here, Tour d'Ancham was able to show how the cuneiform signs of the late pre-Sagonic period, as well as of the time of Gudea of Lagash, were precursors to later cuneiform signs known from the growing corpora of 1st millennium BC texts. The other three major early corpora of Mesopotamian texts, from Farah, Demdet Nasser, and Uruk, were not yet excavated or published before the 1920s and 30s, and no dedicated list of archaic signs was available before Tour d'Ancham's 1927 study of the growing corpus of archaic texts, by then counting 30 texts. That then was the situation when Jacques de Morgan in 1897 began his excavation of Susa in southwestern Iran, a site that was going to produce then the first large corpus of archaic texts. These excavations, of course the stuff of novels, unfortunately led a little too much to imagination. Jacques de Morgan, who was of training a mining engineer turned archaeologist, had negotiated an agreement with the Shah of Iran, Shah Qajar, to excavate Susa and other sites in western Iran that gave Morgan full rights to the finds. He proceeded to excavate away Susa without much regard for real stratigraphy, but a keen eye to an imaginary one, which he believed would reveal the major developments in the long history of humankind. Following a survey of the Acropolis Mound performed by digging tunnels into the side of the mound, Morgan set about to excavate the entire mound. In about 10 years, his more than 1,000 workers had removed the remains of the last 5,000 years from the Acropolis Mound of Susa and discovered countless ancient artifacts, enough to fill a museum. The epigraphist at Susa, Father Vincent Chale, who we heard about yesterday, compared the newly discovered texts to the other early examples of writing found in Western Asia and then known, including a seal with Indus signs, also found at Susa, and the Walters tablet that I mentioned before. And Chale concluded that the very oldest one was the seal with the Indus signs, as he felt the signs were truly hieroglyphic, and therefore very ancient. Second place went to the Walters tablet, as its signs were considered somewhat hieroglyphic, and the third place to the Proto-Elamite tablet, as it was felt the signs were already cuneiform shaped and more abstract. As a matter of fact, the Indus seal is by far the youngest of the three objects Chale compared. And the Waters tablet may very well be younger than the Proto-Elamite tablet, although this particular one, as with most stone tablets, is difficult to date. Scheel published the first almost 800 Proto-Elamite tablets within a few decades of the first discovery. And although the quality of his drawings was generally rather good, a set of systemic errors already beleaguered work on Proto-Elamite. Scheel would often not publish the reverse of tablets, even if they were inscribed, and he almost never copied the top edges of tablets, whether inscribed or not. For deciphering administrative texts, the presence or absence of a total on the reverse, summarizing the information on the obverse of the tablet, is of course crucial information. And top-edge inscriptions may hold key to a primitive notation system in Proto-Elamite. Coming as they did shortly after the excavations at Girsu, Scheel therefore naturally followed in the footsteps of Toledos and produced a list of Proto-Elamite signs appended to his first substantial publication of the Proto-Elamite texts. And like Toledos, he added first millennium cuneiform equivalencies to some of these. He chose to add Neo-Assyrian sign forms that would then, one guess, serve as a key to finding these signs in, for example, Toledos' list. These comparisons were, of course, very unsuccessful. And as can be seen from this plate, Scheel was only able to suggest cuneiform sign parallels to a few of the Proto-Elamite signs. And truth be told, most of these are wrong. In fact, it was only with the excavations at Uruk and the contemporary excavations at multiple sites in southern Iraq in the 20s and 30s that the chronology of the early stages of the cuneiform culture became more certain, and with it, the chronology of the archaic texts. The German team, under the direction of Julius Jordan, uncovered the first substantial archaeological remains of an archaic city at Uruk. The large building offered clear proof of a stratified, complex, ancient state, and the textual finds have come to support that understanding. With his edition of the first about 600 Uruk tablets, mostly from Uruk stratigraphic level 4, Adam Falkenstein proved the linear relationship between the signs of the archaic texts from strata 4 and 3 at Uruk and later cuneiform signs. And he sorted the chronology of archaic texts from the sites of southern Mesopotamia, and he discussed the connection between Proto-Elamite and the archaic texts from Uruk, stating, and I quote, "I think it is possible that in Susa, stimulated by Babylonian writing, people began to create their own writing system in the Jemdet Nasser period. The idea of writing has surely not been invented twice in these two neighboring countries that live in constant exchange." End of quote. Falkenstein also highlighted the lack of language information in the archaic texts. And finally, he proved that the vast majority of the texts were administrative. By doing so, he therefore also ended the early work on proto-cuneiform. Since the text did not immediately reveal any historical or literary facts or any linguistic data, few Assyriologists bothered to work on these texts in the following generation. As Englund wrote in 1998, since with few exceptions, no sign sequences or even clusters seem to correspond to sequences of signs which in later texts represented as spoken Sumerian, the contribution of early Assyriologists to the decipherment of proto-cuneiform ended. Falkenstein also never published the bulk of the textual material from the early levels at Uruk, where archaic tablets and fragments continued to be excavated until 1976. This task was passed on to Hans Nissen, who in 1964, 2 years before the death of Falkenstein, began to catalogue all of the archaic tablets and fragments recovered at Uruk. This project, later known as the Berlin Uruk Project, with Nissen's move to Berlin, eventually succeeded in publishing or aiding the publication of almost all known archaic Mesopotamian texts. The Berlin Uruk Project therefore made the groundwork for all later research on proto-cuneiform, as the texts from Uruk levels 4 and 3 and Jemtnet Nasser have become known. And most importantly, they made available for research the later Uruk period 3 texts and the large number of lexical texts, mostly excavated after Falkenstein's archaische Texte aus Uruk 1 or 1 volume. These texts enabled the advancement in understanding of the late Uruk period that we have become familiar with. However, unlike proto-cuneiform, where comparisons allowed Assyriologists to read many archaic texts and then find them uninteresting, the same was not the case with Proto-Elamite. Although almost all the texts were published quickly and with longer and longer sign lists accompanying each publication, here MDP 31 with its list counting more than 5,000 signs, the texts resisted decipherment. However, behind this lack of progress was a systemic error in the study of writing systems. The attempt to establish the value of a sign in one system using the value of a graphically similar sign in another. That is, of course, doomed to fail. Contemporaneously with the work of the Berlin Uruk project, Piero Merigi in Italy embarked on his study of the Proto-Elamite writing system, and his 1971-74 publication included an index of the signs, a graphotactical analysis of sign use, and new editions of almost all texts. It was also furnished with a perhaps less successful attempt at identifying a syllabary in the Proto-Elamite texts, and the study was to some extent burdened by dependence on the old editions of Shale and McNem and the assumption that Linear Elamite was a successor script to Proto-Elamite. However, Merigi's sign list also suffered from a high number of technical errors, such as the mirroring of many signs, as well as interpretive errors such as the assignment of Latin translations to some signs and the incorrect translation of numerical notations into Roman numerals. However, the reduction of the number of signs, laudable as it was, listing many semantically distinct signs as variants based purely on their graphical shape, is in my opinion the most significant error. Nevertheless, it remains the only useful published list, and my own working sign list is based to a large extent on that of Merigi. But in fact, the breakthrough in the decipherment of both Proto-Elamite and Proto-Cuneiform did not come before the work of first Göran Friberg and later Peter Damarov and Bob Englund on the numerical systems of the archaic texts from Uruk and Susa. A basic understanding of what was a numerical sign and what was not was immediately obvious to the first scholars working on the archaic texts, both from Uruk and Susa, due to the similarity with later Sumerian numerical signs. Knowing how the Sumerians used a sexagesimal system for their bookkeeping, Falkenstein and others, of course, searched for evidence that this system was also used in archaic texts, and they were successful, and a sexagesimal system was correctly identified in the texts. However, many notations did not immediately make sense, especially not when trying to translate these with sexagesimal notations, and Stephen Langdon, and others quickly posited the existence of a decimal system in the archaic Mesopotamian texts. Since a decimal system had already been proven in the Proto-Elamite texts, together with a sexagesimal system, some scholars saw this as evidence of Elamite influence in Mesopotamia. Others as proof that the inventors of cuneiform did not speak Sumerian. The system that scholars, including Falkenstein, had misunderstood was in fact one of the most frequently attested numerical systems, the one we today call the She system or the grain capacity system. Falkenstein and others believed it had a decimal base, and when the summations didn't make sense, reading the notations as decimal, these modern scholars suggested that the ancient scribes had made mistakes, or that the text included unwritten taxes, or gave similar, sometimes quite elaborate reasons for the discrepancies. In his publication, The Early Roots of Babylonian Mathematics, Volume 1, Friberg was able to show how the content-specific capacity system, comparable to the standard Sumerian Gur system, had existed from the beginning of writing in both Uruk and Susa, thereby eliminating the need to excuse the ancient scribes as bad students or invent elaborate missing information. Damarov and England took Friberg's work further and improved on the understanding of the numerical signs in their contribution to the Archaische Texte of Uruk II. Friberg, of course, also made important observations on the relationship between proto-cuneiform and Proto-Elamite, for example, stating in his usual careful style, and I quote, "The discussion above leads us to the tentative conclusion that the Proto-Elamite Xie system is a slightly improved copy of a somewhat older Proto-Sumerian, that is Proto-Cuneiform, Xie system." And I think the students and scholars suggesting that Proto-Elamite is older than Proto-Cuneiform are not related ought pay better attention to this and other comments in Early Roots of Babylonian Mathematics 1 and 2, Archaische Texte aus Uruk II, and elsewhere in the literature. So since most of the Proto-Cuneiform and Proto-Elamite texts were administrative, a complete understanding of the numerical signs and systems allowed scholars to decipher the content of large numbers of texts that had previously escaped any detailed interpretation. Moreover, it allowed scholars a truly astonishing understanding of the workings of an archaic state through the understanding of its bureaucracy. In the meantime, a significant new find of Proto-Elamite tablets had been made in Iran outside of Susa and the western regions, namely the eastern Kerman province, at the site of Tepe Yahya. And these 26 tablets were first worked on by Merigi, before later the task of publishing them was handed over to Peter Damarov and Bob Englund, who by then had already begun their work on Proto-Elamite as an aside to their work on Proto-Cuneiform. They published the Yahya text in 1989 with a complete reconstruction of the numerical systems of the Proto-Elamite texts, while also providing a clear methodological pathway for future work on Proto-Elamite texts using information from the numerical systems, the structure of the texts, comparisons with similar texts from ancient Mesopotamia, and methods such as hierarchies of goods, ratios between units, and so forth. My own work then has taken 3 directions: publications of the texts, cleaning of the data, and the production of a new sign list. But I have been lucky to have sometimes the time to write an occasional article advancing the understanding of Proto-Elamite texts, such as in 2005, when I wrote an article dedicated to texts concerning sheep and goat herding, and proposed a decipherment of the signs for sheep and goat and related terminology, basing myself on the methodology established by Damarov and Englund in their publication of the Yahya texts. So, where is Proto-Elamite studies going? I think there is scope for a lot of new and exciting research, but first we have to make sure we produce accurate copies of all of the extant tablets and high-quality images as well. And over the past 2 decades, members of the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, in many ways the successor project to the Berlin Uruk project, have produced catalog data and well-structured online transliterations of almost all of the extant Proto-Elamite tablets. And following the conclusion of an agreement first with the Louvre and then with the National Museum of Tehran, we've also managed to produce high-quality images of almost all of the tablets and fragments. And recently I published a batch of the remaining fragments and tablets here in the Louvre. And together with Sepide Yeganeh, Simin Piran, and Jebel Nokande, I'm now in the process of publishing another 100 tablets and fragments kept in the National Museum of Iran in Tehran. Sepide Yeganeh, who I just mentioned, is now embarked on a PhD study with me, looking to first group the Proto-Elamite tablets according to criteria such as owner signs, object signs, seal impressions, and then to compare the tablets of these groups with information from the excavation reports when they exist, and new chemical analysis of the clay to see whether tablets were kept together with the goods they recorded and whether they traveled and so forth. And those sorts of research questions are of course very important, but usually mostly picked up by archaeologists and the few Assyriologists brave enough to try and keep current on debates in that field. Reaching a much bigger audience is announcements on the linguistic decipherment of ancient scripts. For that to be possible, the text obviously need to contain sufficient linguistic data, or any linguistic data. And as we saw earlier, even Adam Falkenstein doubted that the Uruk IV texts, with their random sign order in his opinion, and lack of syllabic signs, that they coded much or any language. Bob Englund was of the opinion that both Uruk 4 and Uruk 3 texts coded language, but not necessarily Sumerian, whereas Peter Damerow would have agreed with Falkenstein. Most Sumerologists, of course, just read these texts as Sumerian, mostly, of course, without having spent much time reading Uruk period texts. The situation is different for Proto-Elamite, as the linear structure of the texts have prompted scholars to suggest that it is a better candidate for a linguistic decipherment than proto-cuneiform. Proto-cuneiform texts are organized in what Peter Damerow termed visual hierarchies, closer to spreadsheets than to text. And Piero Merigi suggested that a Proto-Elamite text contained a nested syllabary, and I've myself in the past also argued for this. The argument for identifying a syllabary in Proto-Elamite is connected to the identification of strings of signs that represent personal names. So let us first see how personal names are written in other comparable archaic corpora. And this is the topic of another DPhil student of mine, Yishan Si. And Yishan is looking at how names are written in all of the archaic texts, starting with the archaic text from Ur, dated to early dynastic 1-2, before moving on to the Uruk 3 Jemdet Nasser text, and finally looking at the Proto-Elamite text. And in the archaic text from Ur, the situation is straightforward. Personal names are written primarily with logographic signs, with occasional added syllabic value signs used to disambiguate the logograms by indicating their reading or providing a grammatical ending. For the Uruk 3 texts, things are much more difficult. None of the names in the excerpt from this text here can easily be aligned with names known from the later Sumerian corpora. Additionally, all of them can be explained as semasiographic writing without the need for syllabic values. In fact, we find no certain Sumerian names in the late Uruk texts. Mr. Enlil-T, much debated since the discovery of the Jemdet Nasser texts, might much more likely be a title of an overseer of the armory of writing of the city name Nippur or similar than a Sumerian name meaning something with Enlil and live. Moving on to the Proto-Elamite corpus, with its linear writing style, often suggested as a better suited for true writing than the spreadsheet-like Uruk texts, we find indeed strings of signs repeated throughout the corpus, made up of a subset of the signary, and in positions that could be suggested to represent personal names. These proposed personal names are primarily found within lengthy strings of signs in late or very late Proto-Elamite texts, where the minimal position we can take is that these long strings of signs describe either the object or the origin or destination of the object of each entry. We can add to that the number of signs in this subset of the sign inventory, and the repetition patterns these signs exhibit may agree with some syllabaries in later corpora. However, the number of signs and the repetition patterns that made me and others believe that this subset of the signs represented as syllabary could be compared easily to non-linguistic symbol systems such as Central Asian Tamgas or Pictish symbols. All writing systems have syntax, but so do some non-linguistic symbol systems. In fact, there are several good arguments against the evidence of a syllabary in Proto-Elamite. And to briefly argue against the existence of syllabically written personal names in Proto-Elamite, I will go back to an article I wrote some 4 or 5 years ago together with 2 former students of mine, Kate Kelly and Laura Hawkins. In this article, we discussed a group of texts that without any doubt list humans. In the example here on the screen, we see how the text lists groups of workers in small units. Each unit consists of small numbers of male and female workers and children. But none of these workers are identified with complex strings of signs from the proposed or supposed syllabary. It is only the entry which may designate the foreman or an institution or a temple or a household of each team which is identified with a longer string of signs from the proposed syllabary. There is no way of proving that this foreman is identified by his name written syllabically and not by a string of non-linguistic symbols identifying his affiliation or similar. We can therefore not be certain that such long strings of non-numerical signs include the personal names of individuals, and we can't rule it out. Such a conclusion may seem disappointing to some, but I think it is important to always be honest about what the data can tell us. Facts matters, footnotes are important, and the research on this fascinating writing system continues, with the tablets providing us a lot of interesting insight into the daily lives of people. What did they eat? How did they live? How did they work? Etc. Without, unfortunately, speaking directly to us. Thank you very much for your attention.